Hey everybody, welcome back. This is a video for Econ 170, Economics of Regulation, and we're going to talk about regulating potentially competitive markets. And so this looks a lot at partial regulation, deregulation, and just this idea that there's a lot of gray area between a natural monopoly or a true perfect monopoly and a perfectly competitive market, or even just a truly competitive, effectively competitive market. And so these potentially competitive markets are going to be markets that have a small number of firms and might demand some price or entry and exit regulation, some economic regulation of some kind, even though they can still behave somewhat competitively. So I'm going to draw the graph on the dot cam, so you won't see me, but hopefully that helps you get a sense of what we're talking about. So let's get started. Okay, so for this problem, you guys have a printed out assignment that's got a graph on it. When I used to do this in person, that pen doesn't work, I would do the graph with everyone all together. But for our purposes, I feel like it was a little bit more helpful to have the graph already in place because it gets a little bit tricky. But you can recreate it on your own, and I'm going to prove that by doing that right here. So we've got a graph of a market that's potentially competitive, by which we mean it's got more than one firm in it, but it might not be fully or perfectly competitive, right? It might not be competitive enough to avoid regulation, and it's going to depend on some stuff. So we've got the market quantity and the costs up here, and then I've got this big long demand curve. Sorry, I know it gets a little noisy when I'm playing with my pens. So I'll put that here. Even taking out the straight edge. Demand is a function of price. And then we have this small average cost curve over here. Let's do that. And average cost is, of course, a function of quantity. And so there's a lot of points that we could indicate on this graph. What's already given in the form are the minimum or efficient scale quantity, so the cost minimizing quantity. So I'm going to draw that in. And then there's a regulation price. So remember, costs are minimized when average cost is at its minimum. That's that. Oops. I guess I could have made that. So I would call that Q hat because that's what the book calls it. And that's that competitive equilibrium quantity. And then there's also a couple of other prices along there. But let's fill those in as we go. So let's go into the questions. So graph the effect of a price. We have a graph with a price regulation where the price is set above marginal cost. We want to indicate the competitive equilibrium price, quantity, and efficient scale. Oh, well, they already did that. That's the efficient scale quantity. That is the competitive equilibrium quantity. And then the competitive equilibrium price is going to be P star right there. So we've got our competitive price is P star, and our competitive quantity is Q star, and efficient scale occurs at Q hat. So far, so good. Oops. Oh, super classy. Okay. What is the effect of regulating price at P bar, and what is the lost consumer surplus? So again, that's already on the form in yours, but I'm going to go ahead and make my own P bar. And you can do this too if you don't have the resources or the inclination to print it out. This is perfectly fine. You don't have to use a straight edge too. I'm just trying to make it look classy. So if I have a regulation set at P bar, I'm going to see a quantity Q bar prevail. So at P bar, Q bar prevails. And that's just saying that if prices are regulated higher than the market equilibrium or the competitive equilibrium, quantity is going to go down, right? What's the effect on consumer surplus? Well, remember, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. So if consumer surplus was previously in the competitive equilibrium here, above P star and below the demand curve, we're going to see it shrink. And this is one of the tricks that the book uses, is if this is point A and this is point B, then we can say that consumer surplus shrinks from, let's say, consumer surplus shrinks from, do we have a label for that point? Nope. Okay. From the triangle P star to B to, let's call this P naught, and we can label it. To the triangle P bar A P naught, right? So now our consumer surplus is just this smaller triangle here. You don't have to draw it. You can just say that the consumer surplus shrinks as a result of the higher price and the lower quantity demanded, right? So consumer surplus shrinks generally. The lost consumer surplus is this area here, right? So however you feel comfortable doing that. Okay. What happens if price regulation is not coupled with, assume that there are already 10 firms in the market. If this market is only partially regulated, what is likely to happen? What happens if price regulation is not coupled with entry regulation, and what happens to the welfare costs of the firms? And so we talked about these things generally in class, and in the graph that's printed out or in the form, there are a lot of great points like this, where we can see different levels of entry, different levels of the numbers of firms. So remember, that's the big idea here, is as the number of firms increases, the cost is going to go up. And that's because if this is the efficient scale, as the number of firms increases, the individual quantities will decrease because they're all splitting that same larger Q bar. So Q bar divided by N is going to decrease as N increases, is another way to put it. Does that make sense? So if we started out with a situation with 10 firms in the market, maybe this is Q bar divided by 10. If we go to Q bar divided by 11, we're going to see our market move up the average cost curve, meaning that producing the same market quantity is getting more expensive. So the average cost associated with producing Q bar will increase, and so that's going to result in a welfare loss. What else can we say about this? So if the market is only partially regulated, what's likely to happen? Why would we see firms enter? Well, we're going to see firms enter because of this high price, right? This regulated price is going to motivate firms to enter. And so with just price regulation, we're going to tend to see firms want to enter. As firms enter, we're going to move up the cost curve and see a welfare loss associated with that. That's the really big idea here. The really big idea is partial regulation is problematic because if we regulate price above cost, there's an incentive for firms to enter, and that's going to drive prices up. So what happens if price regulation is not coupled with entry and exit? If P bar is the regulation, let's say if P bar prevails as a regulation, not at, firms will enter and average cost will increase as the quantity produced by each individual firm decreases. That's going to increase firm costs and reduce welfare. That's it. That's the big idea here. That's the point of this graph, is saying, hey, this isn't a true natural monopoly, right? There's clearly enough demand and costs are low enough to have firms. But if we regulate price, we might see problems with firm entry, and the number of firms is small enough that one firm entering or exiting can have an effect on the cost of provision, can have an effect on the market, and that's going to be problematic. So there's a version of this where we can go through with mathematical examples. So we could say, instead of just looking at this generally, if we have, we could go through and say, okay, well, if we assign values to the prices and quantities, we can calculate the consumer surplus, we can calculate the profits that the firms earn, and we can calculate the rising costs per unit. But the big idea here is the idea that if we move from, say, 10 firms to 11 firms, we're going to see cost go up by this amount, and that's going to be that welfare loss. And if there's no entry regulation, there's no reason for firms to continue entering up until the point when they reach the regulated price. And then we're going to see maybe 15, maybe 20 firms. We're going to see costs be very, very high, and we're going to see producer surplus be low. Because remember, when we see that increase in the average cost, that's going to decrease that producer surplus and reduce welfare. So hopefully that kind of clears up how this problem works. The big idea here is this idea of first best effects, which says that price regulation that deviates from marginal cost is going to cause a welfare loss. And that's based on that difference between marginal cost. And so we can think about P star being that competitive marginal cost price. And this higher price is going to mean we have a greater need for regulation to pursue. We have to watch out for the deadweight loss associated with that. The size of the deadweight loss is going to be proportionate to the size of the difference in price, and partial regulation is going to be problematic. Only regulating price in this case would make things worse than if we regulated price and entry and exit. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions about this, let me know. Let me zoom out so you can kind of see the whole thing here. But those are the big takeaways from this assignment. That's the idea here. So let me know what you think. Let me know what questions you have, and we'll talk about this more next time.